There's an expansive government sector largely invisible that most citizens know little about. They're called special districts, and they come in all shapes and sizes, covering everything from fire protection districts, flood control districts, irrigation districts, veterans memorial districts, and even community cemetery districts, just to name a few. The Little Hoover Commission recently took a look at these special districts. Our guest, Carole, the executive director of Little Hoover Commission, will tell us what they found out about these largely unknown local government entities. What's so special about special districts?
Additional funding for the Maddy report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. Chevron's Coalinga oil field and Fresno County have been doing side by side for over 100 years. Learn more at doers.com. From the California Channel at the state capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. So what is a special district? It could be one of 29 varieties. It almost sounds like ketchup. You have airport districts, you've got flood control districts, you've got veterans memorial districts, all kinds of districts. In fact, there are thousands literally in the state of California, and they collect billions of dollars and they employ tens of thousands of workers. But only the most avid policy wonk really knows who they are and what they do. We're going to see if we can get our audience up to speed on special districts with the help of Carole, the Executive Director of Little Hoover Commission, who recently conducted an in-depth study on these little-known but highly influential local government agencies. So we'll start off, what is a special district?
A special district is very simple. It's a local government that's created by community residents to provide a specific service or to fill a void where maybe the service is being provided but not adequately. So they typically have a locally elected board, and they're funded through potentially property tax revenues, fees, depending on the type of the district, or sometimes both.
I think people might be looking at their ballots sometimes and see this on that they have no idea what these organizations do. Well, in 2000, almost 20 years ago, the legislature expanded the authority of these things called Lafcos to conduct what's called municipal service reviews of these special districts. I know it's a little bit policy wonkish there, but what are these municipal service reviews and what are they supposed to do?
Sure. So to back up a little, back in the 60s, the California legislature and the governor had the foresight to create these local agency formation commissions, or LAFCOs. And it was at a time the state was growing by leaps and bounds, and their role was really to set local boundaries, but they also got a role in overseeing special districts.
And they're in every county. All
58.
All 58 counties have a LAFCO. Okay.
And so in 2000, there was a lot of reform efforts, and they were given expanded duties, one of which was this municipal service review. And so basically they're tasked with going out, looking at a special district or other local government, figuring out what service do you provide, is this the most efficient, the most effective way of doing it, coming back with recommendations, maybe there's some performance improvements, or maybe they recommend that this district should be dissolved or consolidated.
Past its prime. So what did you guys also did, the Little Hoover Commission did a report about special districts in 2000. What did you find?
So at that juncture, we found that there were these districts, many of them proliferated from the early 1900s, particularly in the 50s and later, and many of them were potentially no longer serving the purpose that they were designed for. So we found that they were slow to change their ways, slow to consider consolidations. We had some serious concerns at the time, and again with some of the reserve issues, how money set aside to do what. We also had some issues with the lack of transparency. Back in 2000, a lot of these didn't even have websites. It was hidden government at the worst.
Right. It's interesting, people are concerned about fraud, waste, and abuse. These special districts collecting a lot of money, people don't really know what's going on with them, and so this is an area ripe for review. You mentioned that there was a proliferation of special districts in the 60s. Today, how does California compare to other states when it comes to the use of special districts?
So this study was really interesting in that we found California had really exploded. I mean, we had very rural communities and they had needs, flood control, irrigation districts, very important things that are vital to growing communities. So they proliferated all the way through the 70s up until about 1997 is when they peaked. In California, they've actually declined by 5%. Whereas we found nationally, they're still growing, and it's grown by 10%. So we've actually reined in a little bit.
So why the new review? You just did this new review on special districts. Why?
So there were a couple reasons. One, it was to look back and say, we made these recommendations 17 years ago, what's happened? But we also, in the 15-16 legislative session, there was a proliferation of bills that were targeting special districts, which sent a flag to the commission saying, is there a reason that these local issues are percolating up to the legislature? Is there a reason that maybe the local process isn't working? So we wanted to look at that. And
it's interesting you mentioned that because that is democracy, right? And usually democracy responds to an issue. They're not proactive, they're reactive. And so that's why it was, these things were appearing in the legislature, these bills, and you caught that. So,
Right.
So you decided to do a report. What were your general findings of how special districts can really improve their efficiency and effectiveness?
So this was really interesting. As you described at the beginning, there was no one-size-fits-all solution. What works for the Metropolitan Water District serving millions of people in Southern California isn't going to work for the cemetery or the library district. But so where we focused and where our recommendations typically are found are on the areas of oversight. Are these Lafcos, are they doing their job? Do they have the right authority? Is there some obstruction? Is there an obstacle? Is something that could be done differently? And then on transparency, as we looked at previously, how do people know what are these districts? Who do they serve? Where does their money come from? What do they spend it on? Who are their boards? How do they get involved? So those were the two general areas that we looked at.
Interesting. Well, when we come back, we're going to talk about special districts, those that have outlived their usefulness. What do you do? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking about special districts. Over 2,000 of them exist in California, collecting billions of local tax dollars. What can be done to make them more efficient and effective? We're talking with Carole, head of the Little Hoover Commission that recently conducted an in-depth analysis of special districts in California. Your first recommendation seems to be that the legislature and the governor basically should butt out, should stop interfering with the Lafco deliberative process. In fact, you state that they should only get involved when, quote, the local governing elites are so intransigent or negligent or so beholden to entrenched power structures that some higher form of political authority is necessary. That's a mouthful, unquote.
Yeah.
So how do you make that determination? How do you know?
So again, these are local districts created by local community members. And you had, as I described earlier in this segment, this percolating up to the legislature where you have 120 people from all over the state deciding an issue that really affects, one little district inside one county. And so on the surface, it doesn't seem like that's a good idea because you're not going to have people knowing what's going on in that particular county. So yeah, when does it hit that point where it is just so intractable? I think when you've had a successful Lafco, which there are many in the state, trying and trying again and having nothing happen, or there are corners of the state where the Lafcos, either because they have inadequate resources or just have...
Some of them are understaffed.
Yeah, understaffed, and maybe their appointees are entrenched in the local politics, and you have community members who are saying, hey, wait a minute, my property taxes are going to this thing. I've gone to the Lafco. I haven't got satisfaction. This is still happening, and then that's when it rises to the legislature.
I would assume that some of these special districts, they have people that get elected year after year after year, and nobody even knows who they are, and they're just basically doing this with nobody looking over their shoulder. You rarely, in fact, I've never seen a report, I think, from the Little Hoover Commission that actually recommends additional funding. That's never really your answer as a solution to a problem, but this time you did. Why, and what should it be used for, or how much?
So it's really budget dust, maybe $1 million to $3 million.
I'm sure when our audience hears like $1 million to $3 million, that's not budget dust. But really, when you talk about $120 or so billion state budget, it really is.
Right, and then you're thinking in the perspective of could this, in the long run, save taxpayer dollars? And that's the intent. It's like here we could make a little bit of an investment, and what would it go towards? It would help some of the low-hanging fruit where they just don't have the money to consolidate. They know they need to, they want to, and so you could perhaps take 5 districts and turn it into one, get rid of a lot of bureaucracy. So the end game would be to save money.
I think I have a tag slogan for this: millions for billions, because you've got $20 billion special districts are spending. If you spend $1 million or $3 million to then maybe get rid of some of these special districts, you can then save a tremendous amount of money. I think that's basically your point. You also note in your report that there are an unknown number of inactive districts statewide. All of these are candidates that are for dissolution. That resulted actually in the passage of a bill this year, SB 448. How will that address the problem?
So that gives the local Lafco the authority to do away with these inactive districts. So right now you've got a lot of these districts that are on the books, and the process to eliminate them is expensive. You know, it requires potentially a vote. And so this is going to ease the red tape on at least those that are inactive. And no one even knows, as we said, we don't even know how many there are. So that'll get rid of some low-hanging fruit. There was
another thing that happened in the legislature this year, AB 979, also one of your recommendations. It attempts to strengthen Lafcos by giving special districts a voice.
Right.
How would it do that?
So currently, 30 Lafcos have special district representation, and the other 28 don't. And it's been determined that where special districts have a role, not only sometimes is there potentially a little bit more money, but there's a better balance of the district's perspective with the city and the county. Over time, the other 28 counties, there's just a lot of bureaucracy, so this would give a one-time easy process, one swoop, okay, now we can add special districts to these other 28 counties.
It gives them, and also probably helps those deliberations, when the board's having deliberations, some expertise to discuss those issues. You noted that some Lafco reps serve on an at-will basis, in other words, at the will of their appointing agencies. You didn't like that. You thought that was a bad idea. So why did you recommend that the legislature create fixed terms for Lafco members?
So this actually was a recommendation that came to us from Cal Lafco. And they said they had a lot of nuts and bolts types of things. These are the things that could help. And they said not across the board. There's plenty of Lafcos that have folks who serve terms, but others, they don't. So if somebody's on there and they make a decision that doesn't meet the political winds, they get yanked off. So we kind of envisioned it just like our own commissioners are appointed by the governor and the legislative leadership, and they have fixed terms. So while they may have a perspective that the governor or their appointing authority agrees with, they don't have to worry if they make a hard decision.
Right. Next week they're off the board of the panel.
So it's in that spirit.
Okay. You also think that the legislature should simplify the process of consolidations and dissolutions of special districts to create more consistency. What's wrong with the current procedure?
It's really confusing. It's hard for even, us as we were looking at it, experts, not clear at all to the citizens who are supposed to make decisions. So the Lafco process, for example, in order to consolidate or dissolve a district has a certain threshold where a vote's required. It's different if the district itself initiates it. So there was some discussion about, making them consistent, changing them, and where we ended was, at the end of the day, we don't want to just pick something out of the blue and say, okay, now here's the new rule. We wanted to just simplify it so the people could understand. Here's this process, it's clean, this is why it works this way.
Yeah, sometimes like barnacles on a ship, but they just keep adding these rules. Sometimes you just need to simplify things. Last question of this segment, I want to ask you about financial management. That was another issue you addressed in your report. And you focused on reserve funds, the size of them, the purpose of them, and how they're invested. What did you come up with there?
So this was a particularly thorny issue back in 2000 when we started our original study, and it came up again. There's a camp of folks that we heard from in our public hearing process that say there's just too much money. They're sitting on vast sums of money.
So to be clear, if they sit on a reserve, that means that money is not being used for the purpose it was intended, right? It's just being parked.
That's what one camp said. The other camp said, this is good fiscal policy. We're being prudent. We're prepared for a rainy day should something happen.
But you have to balance those two interests. Okay. Well, when we come back, we're going to talk a bit more about special districts, how they can be more transparent, and what should be done with these special districts that are no longer special. That is, they've outlived their usefulness. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute, and we're talking with Carole, the Executive Director of California's Little Hoover Commission, about a recent report they did on special districts. So let's talk about improving transparency and engaging the public. One thing you think that they could do better at is websites. And you're actually very specific about what you'd like to see them do. So what do you think should be included on these special district websites?
Sure. So first, not all of them have a website. So
that's a good place to start.
Let's start there. But then
actually, when you say that, it's a little hard to believe that this day and age that they don't have a website. Okay. All right, so first we start with a website, and then what do we do?
Okay, we were pretty basic. I mean, who do they serve? What's their geography? Who are their clients? How many employees do they have? What is their payroll? Where does the revenue come from? What are they spending it on? What is their reserve policy? Pretty basic, straightforward government stuff, in our opinion.
A lot of this info, though, isn't that reported to the state controller? So why not just have a link on the special district website right to the state controller, and they can find it there?
And we agree with that. I mean, we wouldn't want to create more work because, as you're saying, to put these things on the website, that means somebody has to update them and make sure they're, you know, not years old. So yeah, if the info is there on the state controller's website and they want a link, that's fine.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, I chair of a community foundation, and we are very careful about spending money. We have a website, but you know, it's a cost, and a donor doesn't typically want to see money spent on administration. So I'm sure a taxpayer or someone who's paying into a special district doesn't really want to see money spent on a website. But again, if you spend a little money to have a website so it's clear, maybe taxpayers can spot where there's money that's not being spent properly. So it's, in the long run, probably a good thing, kind of just being prudent. So I want to ask you about, you know, the ballots on elections for special districts. You know, I'm willing to bet that most people, when they look at a ballot, they have this long ballot, and they get down to special districts, first of all, they probably have no idea what the special district does. And so they're not probably even going to vote, much less run for a board or for a seat for that special district. So how do you get the public more engaged and involved with special districts?
Sure. We did find some signs of improvement there. So the California Special Districts Association, and they have a partnership with the Institute for Local Government, they've been trying to work with special districts to help them on public engagement. So not just on a one-time basis where maybe they want to go out and raise money, but on an ongoing basis. So there is this acknowledgement that they exist, that there are opportunities to serve. There's a lot that can be done. What we did find, though, is this is a problem that goes beyond special districts. We had a hearing on voter participation on a different topic, and our commissioners asked some of the county registrars, well, what's the local voting like? They gave us data, and it wasn't just special districts, it was school districts, it was city council, county boards. So it's a bigger problem than special districts.
Yeah, and if they make it, you know, and I look at websites of local government agencies, and sometimes they're very easy to navigate, you can find information. Other times, it is a circuitous route. I mean, you're trying to find this information, like, and I'm sitting there and I'm studying it. It takes me 2 hours to kind of find the information I want when it should be more simple, so people can really access that information. That's a really good point. You didn't evaluate every district, though. You were looking at districts generally, but you did focus on one type of district in particular, and that was these healthcare districts that no longer manage or operate hospitals. Now, these districts were set up, in the 1940s to build hospitals in rural areas where people didn't have access to hospitals. But today, less than half of the current healthcare districts apparently actually run hospitals. So is this an example of a governmental agency that's outlived its usefulness?
So what we found was where once was a rural community is now part of the Bay Area, or part of Southern California coast. So they evolved over time, and yet the district remained. A lot of hospitals have gone out of business. There's an emphasis on preventative care. So there's that issue going on. That
could they transition and fill that void instead of doing hospitals, running a hospital, get more into preventive care, preventive health care?
And the better ones have, and that's where we, again, there was no one size fits all. We found complaints from witnesses and even a board member on one of these healthcare districts saying this needs to go away. We are, you know, taking property tax revenues and we're just doing grants. We own property, we're leasing out property. On the other hand, we found districts that were very targeted at one, for example, childhood obesity. That was their problem. They had a targeted plan. They measured their results.
Yeah, I was going to say metrics are, if they can show that the money being spent is actually resulting in something, there's a return on that investment, and then people are going to say, okay. But if they're not, if there's no there there, then people are going to go, well, why am I spending the money on this?
Right.
Interesting. Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about the future of healthcare. I'm sorry, not just healthcare districts, but special districts generally in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking about local special districts with Carole, the Executive Director of the Little Hoover Commission. They recently did a report on these over 2,000 local special districts that exist in California that generate over $20 billion in tax revenue that most people know little to nothing about. So let's talk about the issue of reserves. We touched on it a little earlier. Let's talk a little more about that. You know, the rainy day funds. A thorny issue in your 2000 report, still an issue in this most recent report. How can voters be assured that there isn't too much money or too little money being set aside? The amount of money being set aside is just right.
That's a hard thing to gauge because what works for one district is not necessarily going to work for the next district. So where we focused a lot on this was on those districts with infrastructure. And what we found when we peeled back the onion a little bit was some of the things that were said to be reserved was actually either infrastructure itself, a facility, or it was money set aside to pay back a bond, which makes sense. So what's enough, what's not enough, it really depends on the district and what need they're serving.
It kind of, I mean, sometimes a rule of thumb in business, what, 5% or 10% reserve to kind of, you know, but again, the more money you set aside in a reserve, which is appropriate and prudent, but it's also money that's not working for you. And so that's a real balance, and that's a policy decision that boards have to make. You know, it seems that there are some special districts, irrigation districts, wastewater districts, flood control districts, that are really on the front lines of adapting to climate change. You guys have done a report earlier on climate change, the impacts of that, and how we should be thinking about addressing those. What do you think these special districts in the front lines of this issue should be doing to prepare for the impacts of climate change?
So, you know, as you mentioned, we've done work in this area before. We focused a lot on what was the state's role, what was the city-county role. Well, as we were doing this report on special districts, we realized these are the folks on the front line. We just ended a horrific, well, we haven't ended, we're still in a horrific hurricane season, and you see flooding. Well, it's the flood control district. It isn't the other local governments. So these districts are the ones that really supply 90% of the water. They're the ones who are dealing with too much rain at once. Drought, on the other hand, not enough snow melt, changes that are just happening over time, and they're trying to be consistent and serve their customers the best they can.
Yeah, certainly in the Central Valley, the irrigation districts, I mean, are very important in terms of getting water, you know, first of all, recharging the groundwater, but also getting water to the farms and those kinds of things. Same thing happens in Southern California, et cetera. In fact, it's interesting, the Fresno Metropolitan Flood Control District was established back in the 1950s because there used to be floods all the time in that area, and they had to do something about it. We don't have that issue really as much anymore. They've done actually a pretty good job, which brings me kind of to my next question, and that is, you know, what kinds of things should these water, wastewater, flood control districts be doing to prepare for the impacts of climate change? I mean, what are the best practices out there?
Sure. So you mentioned Fresno as one. To build on what you said, they've actually invested in a mechanism of facilities that will simultaneously control floodwater in a wet year and then steer it towards facilities to recharge the underground aquifers, which is a very thoughtful way of approaching it. Some of the other districts, Santa Clara Valley Water District, for example, they have the role of protecting some of our tech companies, lots of our tech companies, below sea level. Rising sea level is happening, they know it, and they have, working with multiple government partners, are trying to shore up 18 miles of shore in the hopes of protecting these tech companies from getting inundated. So they're doing levees, they're doing restorative marsh work.
I don't know if the seawater can come in to hit the groundwater and then make that unusable. I don't know, that probably could be another issue that they might be looking at.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting you were talking about the Fresno Metropolitan Flood Control District. That's a mouthful. But I was reading in your report that they recharge over 70% of their rainfall is recharged and captured, which is kind of a big thing. They were way ahead of the curve before the drought. But I guess water is so important everywhere in the state, but particularly in the valley. They were way ahead of the curve on that. So any other examples of folks that you think are doing good stuff, like in Oakland or?
Well, Riverside County comes to mind. That's similar to Fresno, Rancho California Water District. They've converted, you know, this is investing in taking out grass medians, making it drought tolerant. They have put in a program in place where they pay farmers to swap thirsty avocados, for example, for less thirsty wine grapes. So putting in place things that are going to make them resilient to the future of potentially less water.
On the cutting edge. Well, I want to thank Carole D'Alia with California's Little Hoover Commission for joining us. If you want to stay up with state and local politics, you can follow the Maddy Institute on Facebook, Twitter, or log on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.